Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader, and welcome to April. Hey, we're continuing in that unit that's called My Encounter with Jesus. We're in lesson number 5. It's called Jesus Died for Me. The focal passage is going to be various verses out of John chapter 19, and the point of this lesson is Jesus' death on the cross made forgiveness possible for me. Well, the point of this lesson that LifeWay supplies us, it's a good point, and it is a true point, but I really don't see how the scriptures we have points to that statement about forgiveness. Personally, I believe a better point might be that Jesus died on this earth so I could live eternally with him in heaven. That's just me, though. All right, in our previous 4 lessons in this unit, we've looked at 4 different individuals whose lives were radically changed as a result of coming into contact with Jesus. We've looked at the Samaritan woman at the well, the man who was an invalid for 38 years, the woman caught in adultery, and the man born blind. These stories have showed us both physical and spiritual healing. Well, this week's story is a little different. We're going to be looking at 2 Bible characters, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, but not in as much detail as we have with previous characters. Now, we're missing a lot of background information in our text this week. So, you might want to fill your class in on some of those details about what's going on and the timeline here about Jesus' crucifixion. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the crucifixion and what that really entailed. Our first set of verses is John chapter 19, verses 16 through 19. And this is where I'm going to spend the majority of the time in my lesson this week. Pilate handed over Jesus to be crucified. Let's stop right there. Okay, let's talk about crucifixion. This was a very cruel method of execution. Usually the condemned was scourged, and this involved beating the back of the prisoner with a whip that had several leather straps attached to it, and each of those straps at the end had little bits of bone and bits of metal that were attached. So one lash would leave several gashes. Okay, several lashes then would expose underlying muscle and sometimes even bone, skeleton. Many people died alone just from the scourging. This was just the first stage of the crucifixion. Then the condemned was made to carry the crossbeam of his eventual instrument of death. Once at the place of execution, the crossbeam was attached to the longer beam. And now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read, because it was such a good article, I'm going to read this article that I found about the medical aspects of the crucifixion. I have a link to that article below, as well as in the YouTube and in the Facebook comments. And this was going to cover the first set of scriptures that we have, as well as verses 28 through 30. The victim was then placed on his back, arms outstretched, and nailed to the crossbar. The nails, which were generally about 7 to 9 inches long, were placed between the bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna, and the small bones of the hands, the carpal bones. The placement of the nail at this point had several effects. First, it ensured that the victim would indeed hang there until dead. And secondly, a nail placed at this point would sever the largest nerve in the hand, called the median nerve. The severing of this nerve is a medical catastrophe. In addition to severe burning pain, the destruction of this nerve causes permanent paralysis of the hand. Furthermore, by nailing the victim at this point in the wrist, there would be minimal bleeding and there would be no bones broken. Therefore, the scriptures were fulfilled that said in Psalm 22:17, I count all my bones. They look and stare upon me. And in Psalm 34:20 that says, He keepeth all his bones, not one of them is broken. Well, the positioning of the feet is probably the most crucial part of the mechanics of crucifixion. First, the knees were flexed about 45 degrees, and the feet were flexed, bent downward, and at an additional 45 degrees until they were parallel to the vertical pole. An iron nail about 7 to 9 inches long was driven through the feet between the second and third metatarsal bones. In this position, the nail would sever the dorsal pedal artery of the foot, but the resultant bleeding would be insufficient to cause death. With the knees flexed at about 45 degrees, and the victim must bear the weight of the muscles of the thigh. However, this is an almost impossible task. Try to stand with your knees flexed at 45 degrees for 5 minutes. As the strength of the legs gives out, the weight of the body must now be borne by the shoulders. And the result is that within a few minutes of being placed on the cross, the shoulders would become dislocated. Minutes later, the elbows and wrists become dislocated. The result of these dislocations is that the arms are as much as 6 to 9 inches longer than normal. With the arms dislocated, considerable body weight is transferred to the chest, causing the rib cage to be elevated in a state of perpetual inhalation. Consequently, in order to exhale, the victim must push down on his feet to allow the rib muscles to relax. The problem is that the victim cannot push very long because the legs are extremely fatigued. And as time goes on, the victim is less and less able to bear weight on the legs, causing further dislocation of the arms and further raising of the chest wall, making breathing more and more difficult. The result of this process is a series of catastrophic physiological effects. Because the victim cannot maintain adequate ventilation of the lungs, the blood oxygen level begins to diminish, and the blood carbon dioxide, the CO2 level, begins to rise. This rising CO2 level stimulates the heart to beat faster in order to increase delivery of oxygen and removal of CO2. However, due to the pinning of the victim and limitations of oxygen delivery, the victim cannot deliver more oxygen, and the rising heart rate only increases oxygen demand. So this process sets up a vicious cycle of increasing oxygen demand, which cannot be met, followed by an ever-increasing heart rate. And after several hours, the heart begins to fail. The lungs collapse and fill with fluid, which further decreases oxygen delivery to the tissues. The blood loss, hyperventilation, they combine to cause severe dehydration. And that's why Jesus said, "I thirst." And over a period of several hours, the combination of collapsing lungs, a failing heart, dehydration, and the inability to get adequate oxygen supplies to the tissues caused the eventual death of the victim. The victim, in effect, cannot breathe properly and slowly suffocates to death. In cases of severe cardiac stress, such as crucifixion, a victim's heart can even burst. This process is called cardiac rupture. Therefore, it could be said that Jesus died literally of a broken heart. Now, to slow the process of death, the executioner put a small wooden seat on the cross, which would allow the victim the privilege of bearing his weight on his buttocks. The effect of this was that it could take up to 9 days to die on the cross. When the Romans wanted to expedite death, they would simply break the legs of the victim, causing him to suffocate in a matter of minutes. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus said, "Tetelestai," meaning it is finished. Then he gave up the ghost, gave up his spirit. When the soldiers came to Jesus to break his legs, he was already dead. Not a bone of him was broken. So we should never just flippantly say, "Yes, Jesus died for me." It wasn't what we would call today a humane death. No, it was torture. It was the most excruciating pain and suffering that one could imagine. See, the Romans, they perfected this art of crucifixion. And they did that as a way to inflict as much pain and as much suffering as possible, while delaying death as long as possible. And they did this as a deterrent for criminals and other troublemakers, like, "See, this is what awaits you." I would also like to address what seems to be an inconsistency in Scripture. Here in verse 17 it says that he carried the cross by himself. Now we know from the other 3 Gospels that Jesus did this for a while, and then Simon of Cyrene was conscripted to carry the cross for Jesus. So he initially began carrying that cross until he could no longer take it from all the pain and exhaustion of the scourging. And that's when Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry the cross the rest of the way. Now let's go down to that last set of scriptures in verses 38 through 42. Here's where we encounter 2 of Jesus' disciples. And the first is Joseph of Arimathea. He approached Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus so Jesus could be buried. Now, if we look over in Matthew 27, verses 57 through 60, it tells us that Joseph was rich and it was his tomb where Jesus was going to be laid. Mark 15:43 informs us that Joseph was a prominent member of the council. In Luke 23:50 and 51, it tells us that Joseph was a good man. He was a member of the council, but didn't agree with the council's decision and action to crucify Jesus. So we can use those other gospel references to get a better picture of this Joseph. Now, the other disciple was who? It was Nicodemus. He's that same Nick at night that visited Jesus back in John chapter 3. And if we look back in John chapter 7, verses 50 through 52, we see that Nicodemus, he was a Pharisee who stood up for Jesus and challenged his fellow Pharisees about condemning a man without even hearing his side first. So these are the two men who buried Jesus. Now, do you find it interesting, as I do, that two prominent Jewish leaders asked for Jesus' body, but none of the disciples did? In Matthew 26, verse 31, Jesus predicted that his inner circle of disciples would abandon him, and they did. It appears that the only one of the 11 remaining disciples at the cross was John. Now, these two men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, had encountered Jesus, and it so radically changed their life that they were willing to go and ask for the body of Jesus so he could be buried. Now, granted, it states that Joseph did so secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders, but still, it was a bold step to do that. And they not only asked for the body of Jesus, they brought with them 75 pounds of aloe and myrrh and strips of linen to bury Jesus before sundown. Now, do you realize that just by touching the dead body of Jesus that they were now considered ceremonially unclean for 7 days? That's something that every good Jewish boy, especially Jewish leaders, tried to avoid. Yet these two disregarded their temporary lowered status for Jesus, for the greater good. So they took Jesus' body to Joseph's new tomb. It had never been used, wrapped him up, and laid him down. Now, Jesus, the one who entered the world through a virgin's womb, is at the end of his life in an unused tomb. The good old Joe and Nick, they were willing to forego what was the social norm of the day in order to do what was right. They were willing to be ceremonially unclean in order to do this for Jesus. What are some social norms that you or your class are willing to disregard in order for kingdom advancement? So that's a question to ponder. Next week, we're going to be in John chapter 20, and we're going to learn, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. Since this is Easter week coming up, it's a good time to contact your entire class and invite them. Let them know what's going on. So invite your class, pray for your class, pray with your class. Thank you guys very much for watching.